Insight and access indeed. And I can think of no person better to bring us to the intersection of the global economy, global business, and global politics than Bob Zoellick. Bob has had a very distinguished career in economic policymaking, from the Treasury Department in the Reagan years to Undersecretary of State in the first Bush administration to the U.S. Trade Representative, where we served together in President George W. Bush's administration, then president of the World Bank, and now a research scholar at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an author many times, but most recently of a book I would commend to all of you, America in the World. For me, it's personal. He's a very thoughtful colleague and friend. After Bob's remarks, he and I will have a short conversation. Be sure to send me your questions and I'll fold them in. Bob, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Well, Glenn, I'm pleased to be with you. And for the audience, I know you've had a full measure of globalization today. So perhaps you might understand my hesitancy when my friend Glenn invited me to speak on the topic. Nevertheless, given my great respect for Glenn as a scholar and as the most effective CEA chairperson as a policymaker that I've encountered, as well as a superb dean, I decided to sign on. So as I reflected on how to offer you a fresh vantage point, I recalled a man named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, an Englishman, lived at the time of the British Empire of North America, the American and French Revolutions, the Napoleonic Wars, and as Henry Kissinger wrote in his Harvard thesis, the European effort to restore world order. Now, important for this audience, Bentham lived at the era when King's College became known as Columbia. So some of you may recall Bentham's name with the association of the idea of utilitarianism. But few people know that Jeremy Bentham coined the term international. Internationalism was the globalization of that age. And like globalization, Bentham introduced internationalism as part of a packet of ideas. They included arms reductions, free commerce, emancipation of colonies, a permanent court to resolve conflicts among nations, and retaining navies only to curb piracies. Alas, Bentham seems to have written a rather nasty anonymous piece on the American Declaration of Independence, which most scholars trace to the fact that he really didn't like Jefferson's idea of natural rights. Now, what almost no one recalls is that Jeremy Bentham had a younger brother, Sir Samuel Bentham. Sir Samuel was a naval architect who revolutionized naval armament and construction. He served for the Russian Tsar. He fought the Turks. He even visited China to get a knowledge about the ship design of junks. And then he returned to London in 1795, where he built the Royal Navy in the age of Nelson. Sadly, opponents of Sir Samuel's reforms eventually forced him to resign in 1812, but he'd done his great duty to help build the Royal Navy that helped win the Napoleonic Wars. Now, taken together, Jeremy and Samuel Bentham represent different strands or aspects of internationalization, the globalization of 200 plus years ago. So the world of 1800 was also a time of intellectual and revolutionary ferment, international commerce, great power conflicts, and disruptions in the world order. So as you consider globalization today, I want to highlight two tensions similar to those experienced by the Bentham brothers. First, the phenomena of globalization, despite the naysayers, remains powerful, even dynamic, although the governance of globalization is fraying, fracturing, and fragmenting. So when I hear people speak about the end of globalization, I have to scratch my head. And here's Exhibit 1, the COVID pandemic. The United States has lost about 525,000 lives. That's more than we lost in World War II, and it's approaching the number that we lost in the Civil War. And virologists believe that the viral breakouts are increasing in frequency and in cost, and it's closely related to the interconnections among wildlife, livestock, and human beings, especially in Southeast Asia and South China. So we certainly need to think of pandemics as a risk to security as well as to health and economics. Or consider whether climate change and other environmental topics are globalization. Or more traditionally, the effects of monetary and fiscal policies on macroeconomic factors and capital flows. Or data flows, the raw material of digital economies that are pulsing through every sector of the economy. The World Economic Forum reported in 2019 that global data flows were overtaking trade flows in economic value. Or cybersecurity. Or then there's food and energy and other global commodity flows, plus oceanic effects, or migrations, even religious movements, plus the security standbys of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Yet the shocks of the early 21st century have battered national governments, and states have returned increasingly to controls, to reassure publics, to cope with crises, and to reestablish some sense of sovereign power. The internet is now the splinternet, but reactions always breed counterreactions. The breakdowns in global governance stimulated technological adaptations and new types of connectivity. So the gaps in governance have not just been cases of states striking back. Equally important, national governments are failing to cooperate and work with the private sector to advance and negotiate standards, rules, and norms of regional and global interconnections. So the governance of globalization, which is always weak, is now deteriorating. So let's look more closely at trade as an example. Since 2007, the increase in trade shifted from roughly 2 times the growth in GDP over the prior decades to below GDP growth. But the growth in trade and services was roughly 60% faster than the manufacturing trade. Even before COVID, supply chains were becoming less reliant on lower labor costs and more linked to digital platforms, relying increasingly on knowledge-intensive workers. Technology shifts, especially 3D printing, raised the prospects of moving from the development of the 1990s of large batches of specialized components assembled over great distances to manufacturing of small, customized batches near the purchaser. And regional trade patterns assumed greater importance. We started to see area concentrations in autos, computers, electronic equipment. And of course, part of this is China's changing demand and production, and this led to especially striking changes across Asia. And although tariffs have been relatively flat since 2005, although as you heard with the prior speaker, the big boost from the U.S., non-tariff barriers have been rising quite quickly. And the year of COVID has simply accelerated these shifts to digital, data, and cross-border services. We have to expect that more labor services will become tradable. The rules for intellectual property rights, data, and digital services will become even more important. Supply chain managers say that they'll emphasize resiliency and risk management over cost cutting, although I expect that AI will help increase the efficiency of the chains. Blockchain is likely to lessen reliance on third parties to manage transactions and help deal with risk in some parts of the world that might have seemed off bounds to some investors. We'll likely see the development of new infrastructure for platforms and exchange, and of course, older port societies will adapt. And as you've also heard today, sustainability will loom much larger too. So the new combination of trade, technology, data, and finance poses a host of policy issues. Now, in the past, the United States, because it was the leading edge economy, was often the first to press for new rules to support the novel services because it was in the forefront. The Obama administration was listless on trade in its first term before it concentrated on the Trans-Pacific Partnership in its second term, but alas, it was a year too late. In 2015, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, actually passed the negotiating authority, TPA, through the House with the Republican Congress. I believe if TPP had gotten done in 2015, it would have gotten through the Congress, but they were a year too late. And then, as you've heard, President Trump, of course, reversed course. He turned to managed trade. He tried to target bilateral trade deficits, He trashed the rules, he abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was all transactional, no attention to the systemic. As the U.S. moved towards protectionism, it intersected with Xi Jinping's turn to strengthen the role of the state in the economy. Slowness in opening up many sectors in the Chinese economy, and the use of trade to bully partners. So ironically, although the US had led in creating the global trading system, and China had relied on that system to achieve a historic economic transformation, both countries, the world's two largest economies, were undermining the world order of trade. So now let's turn to the second tension that recalls the world of the Bentham brothers, the strain between great power competition and transnational cooperation. During the Cold War, the United States created a unique system of alliances and a dynamic international market economy. And of course, in the decades after the end of the Cold War in Europe, the United States sought to enlarge that order in areas of security and politics and economics. But the first decades of the 21st century started to erode Americans' faith in their ability to promote that order, with attacks on the homeland, sort of long and frustrating wars, the financial and economic shocks, and uncertainties about how to address the transnational challenges such as climate and pandemics. Now, when Xi Jinping became China's leader in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union, and he commanded all the party cadres to view the film. Now, if such a film had been produced in Europe, it would have shown Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version is a little different. Gorbachev was the fool who abandoned the Communist Party, led to the ruin of country, and led to its breakup. And Xi's not so subtle message is, it's not going to happen here. So while the end of the Cold War is a historical issue now being studied at Columbia and other universities, it's a very real and live aspects of policy in China. As my friend Evan Feigenbaum, now at the Carnegie Endowment, pointed out, China really pursued a two-track approach to international strategy. On one track, China worked within the existing system to advance its interest, push its norms, advance Chinese into various positions. Now, frankly, this shouldn't have been a shock. Lots of countries do this. The surprise was President Trump's withdrawal and attacks on the multilateral regimes, opening up more opportunities for China. China did have a second track, however, and that was to try to create alternative models based on China's traditional preference for tributary relations. Under a tributary relations model, other states could benefit from China's growth as long as they treated China respectfully, certainly didn't criticize the Chinese leadership. The Belt and Road Project typifies this. You could call this globalization with Chinese characteristics. Now, President Trump stoked anxieties about China, though his haphazard tactics ended up concentrating on a managed trade deal of purchases, which, by the way, was only about half fulfilled. Ironically, the deal actually reinforces China's state controls because it didn't press state reforms, it was the notion of a purchase deal. When COVID-19 imperiled the Trump administration's reelection efforts, his officials moved from the deal-making model to a full-bore confrontation. In my view, they mistook confrontation for competition. They wrapped the package together with the label of great power competition, but they focused primarily on security terms without ideas for regional economic strategy. And I believe they ignored core U.S. economic strengths, the dynamism, innovation, openness, and connection with allies and partners. The United States can never compete with authoritarian countries by figuring out how much we can close down or close off people. Our strength is our openness. A great power contest with zero-sum or even lose-lose calculations also left no room for cooperative action on the transnational security questions, biological security, climate, or the obvious economic interdependence. Now, as you heard just before me, the Biden administration inherited the momentum of the confrontation with China. And they don't want to look soft, as you can see with the reports coming out of the meeting in Alaska. They want to focus on allies and partners and building back better at home. They might prefer to try to find some off ramps to lessen the risks of serious clashes that could escalate. But again, building on the prior session, I think their multilateralism will be hindered by the wariness of the administration to use trade policy to help develop the rules of the future. I think they're repeating the mistake of the Obama first term, where being overly sensitive to domestic protectionist constituencies. And anybody who knows the world of Asia or even how the European Union works knows that trade and economic parts are a key to international policy. So I began with a touch of history, so I'll close with the same. As Glenn knows well, we've had other eras of globalization. The Bentham brothers at the turn of the Age of Discovery and the move from early empires to Britain's rule as a world power. And then we saw another phase in the late 19th, early 20th century with the transformation of transportation, communications costs, the use of the gold standard to give some comfort for exchange rates and finance. That globalization crashed upon the rocks of great power competition in 1914, opening what historians refer to as the short, calamitous 20th century. So as you leave the events today, I suggest you keep in mind that we need to manage tensions across security, economics, technology, and transnational topics. And you have to do that through some form of international process. And it'll be that political process that will shape the world order and globalization in the 21st century. So we'll need the perspective of both the Bentham brothers, Jeremy and Sir Samuel. And so I compliment the Chazen Institute for encouraging the research that's going on, encouraging the constructive ideas, and most importantly, helping to encourage a new generation of younger scholars that will set the standard for this new age of globalization.
Thanks so much, Bob. And it's hard not to love a set of remarks that begin with hearkening back to an old economist. So thanks so much for that. I have some specific questions based on your talk, but I want to start out with a general one. You had several historical allusions, obviously, in your remarks. Why did you write America and the World? What do you think policymakers can learn in general from history as we think about globalization and trade?
Yeah, well, when I was in government, I often drew upon history in thinking through problems. And so at heart, again, I wanted to encourage others, especially a next generation, including, as you heard today, the use of economic history as well as traditional geopolitics. Now, many foreign policy courses these days are taught using international relations theory. And for the scholars, they're fun to play with. They show some intellectual sort of agility. But to be frank, when I was dealing with issues such as German unification or development of the World Bank or genocide in Darfur, they tended not to offer too much sort of help. And so the heart of the book is to use chapters that focus on practical problem solving. Now, people in this audience may recall Henry Kissinger wrote a book in the 90s titled Diplomacy, and he used history to talk about foreign policy. But given his perspective, he tended to rely more on the European realpolitik perspective. So I wanted to try to write a book that focused on the American ideas and their experience with the multiplicity and pluralism. And I suppose there's one other aspect that you might have encountered in your government service. I sometimes used to torture my younger colleagues by asking them what they knew about history. You probably asked about their economic knowledge. And because I honestly didn't know. And insofar as I discovered they learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And the first 150 years have some fascinating people and events that I wanted to bring back from the mists of time. And so I tried to structure the book around stories. I wanted to make it more appealing to readers. In some ways, it's a multiple biography. And I had a seminar, I have to admit, Glenn, up at Harvard with some faculty and graduate students. And they kept encouraging me, I think wisely, to include my own assessment. So in addition to telling the stories, I kind of add sort of my comparative advantage of this. And I suppose kind of the last two aspects of it, are that I wanted to, in a world where, at least from the outside, it looks like critical studies have seized control of many academies, perhaps not the business school. I wanted to point out that imperfect results in a far from perfect world can still be a good measure. And I wanted to have the idea that history can offer insights on how to do better as opposed to acceptance of timeless obstacles. And the encouraging thing is, as I talked about the book and some professors have started to use it with their classes, I've actually found that students enjoy the idea that you can actually try to address problems and people can get things done.
Well, that's great. I want to pick up on a theme you really hit hard in your remarks about great power competition and transnational cooperation, and think about China and the United States. So there are a variety of ways in which one might imagine those two great economies, these two largest economies in the world, competing. It could be the technology 5G race. It could be regional spheres of influence. You mentioned the battle over TPP, and of course, there's a Chinese successor to that. American leaders sometimes approach this problem of we wish China would do what we want it to do, or we wish China were more like us. Wishes, of course, aren't a strategy. So, how would you think about an economic competition and cooperation strategy with China? Where are there things we're never going to change Chinese views, and where might we find common ground?
So, first, of course, this has to start at home. And we'll see how the legislation works out. But for those looking for some positive sense of bipartisanship, there's an act that Chuck Schumer, the Democrat of New York, has proposed with Todd Young, Republican of Indiana, called the Endless Frontier Act. And I take special pride in this because one of my chapters is about a man named Vannevar Bush, who was the founder of American science policy after World War II. And his report was called About Science, the Endless Frontier, which I know Senator Young had some familiarity with. So, and of course, beyond that, it's kind of keeping the United States open, dynamic. As I sort of alluded to in my remarks, I understand concerns about espionage, but I think it's crazy to cut off American universities from foreign students. It's the best advertisement that we have. And in general, our strength, if you think about so much of the innovative companies in America come from immigrants. So we want to try to be an open system. Secondly, the United States, going back to the experience from 1947-49, has always been more effective if it does so with allies and partners. This is kind of a big gap in the Trump approach. And you can see the Biden administration trying to do that. Now, sometimes people assume that we can just tell these other parties what to do. I sort of work closely with President Bush 41 and Secretary Baker, and part of their genius of alliance management was focusing on the most important objectives and being able to compromise on some of the others. And then as you come to the issue of China, I think one unfortunate part of the sort of the wave of debate is that there's a new conventional wisdom that cooperation with China failed. And I see an article almost every day on this. And that's just historically totally wrong. I mean, not only on issues of sanctions with Iran or UN Security Council sanctions, but certainly on the economic side. As you know, in the global financial crisis, China had sort of the best stimulus response. It actually moved its current account to zero. It quit manipulating its exchange rate. It was the fastest growing destination for U.S. exports for 15 years until the Trump administration. Now, my point is not to say that all is well, but as you know, in the economics field, it's different sometimes the way security people think. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum calculation. You can find a sort of mutual interest here. And there was a good article actually written by a young professor now at the University of Oregon um, uh, that in the most recent Foreign Affairs that talked about the WTO experience and explained how actually the WTO accession sort of worked with reformist movements, helped make change in the process of China. Now, you've got people from the asset management industry as sort of part of your group. And you obviously, if you're BlackRock or if you're sort of Bridgewater or others today, you have to see yourself as getting involved in the asset management market and the bond market in China, in part because of different correlations in the growth. And of course, from the Chinese side, they want to move towards more institutional investors, greater liquidity, so you can see them opening up the market. And there are countless examples of, I found, that where you could, the Chinese, as you know, technocrats are very sophisticated people instead of trying to understand the common interests. And I'll give you one that is in today's news that also would suggest that while the U.S. can work, it can also use leverage. So as you know, there's a debate about an additional SDR allocation for the IMF to help developing countries. And we could have a discussion about whether that's the most efficient way to do so. But if the U.S. is going to move forward on SDRs, what I would have done if I were Secretary Yellen is I would approach Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, and said, you know, I might be able to get the U.S. to be able to move on this, but I need something in return. And China has a very large debt buildup, and it's willing, in developing countries, particularly Africa, it's willing to restructure its Exim debt, but not its China Development Bank debt, which it asserts are more like commercial bank debt. So I would say to Kristalina, look, if you could get the Chinese to agree to restructure some of the China Development Bank debt, maybe I can move on the IMF issue or the SDR issue. And it's a good example of how you could do well and do good at the same time, but you have to be willing to use your leverage on some of these issues. And you know, I find in many cases, if you think about the Chinese economic problems, as you know well, and the people at your institute know, they're not 10 feet tall. They've got a lot of problems along the way here, and certainly then if you take this to the issues of climate or biological security, we have a common interest here in working on these issues. So at heart, I think one of the problems is that we're kind of left with this hostile attitude from the Trump administration that allows people to pound their chests and say, oh, I'm going to be tough on China. From my years of experience across many administrations, the real game is kind of what results do you have? And so I don't frankly see showing strength by just sort of bludgeoning the other guy. I mean, to be honest, Hamilton had, since we're talking about economic history, had a wonderful line that was they said, strut is worthless. He said, sort of moderation in manner and, firmness in the thing. And I kind of like that sort of overall approach. And I'll close with one last word on this. Of course, the United States should always stand for its openness as a society. I question sometimes whether just sort of endless sanctioning of people is the right way to approach this. If I would take Hong Kong, for example, and clearly the Chinese are ending the Hong Kong system. But my response would be like Britain had done, which is to say, let's open up opportunities for green cards for people from Hong Kong to come to the United States. What better way would there be to show the difference between a free and an unfree society? So I think there's a lot of work that can be done. At the same time, we have to recognize where we have differences to manage and certain policies in the security area of deterrence.
Those are great answers. I want to pull at a couple of threads of what you brought up. One is about the World Trade Organization, because as your remarks suggested, there was a long evolution of the WTO from the original General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, modifications. We go to the World Trade Organization. Now we have our present struggles. The rules of the WTO aren't particularly well suited for China meeting literal requirements of the WTO. China is nominally part of it, but doesn't really obey by all those rules. What rules should the U.S. be flexible on in the WTO? And or when should we ask, maybe the WTO is not the right structure? Do you have any reform thoughts in mind?
So just a starting point. You know, I go to a lot of sessions and people say, this country is violating the rules. And sometimes I have the temerity to ask, well, which rule is that? And of course, they often have just, it's our rule or our assumption. And, if you're going to try to hold people to rules, you probably end up having to negotiate them. It turns out China actually was pretty good in compliance with the quantitative requirements. And just to put this in perspective, it lowered its barriers much lower than other developing countries like India and Brazil and others. It was on areas like enforcing intellectual property rights. That's where the problem arose. But just to come back to sort of your example, as China has moved up the technology curve, it has its own interest in enforcing intellectual property rights. And the data that I had was that it created special intellectual property rights courts in a number of cities. They're deciding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties are too low. So I'd be negotiating higher penalties. So coming back in terms of the WTO, first, I think you know, success breeds success. So I would focus first on some modest gains, for example, dealing with restrictions on exports of health equipment. And I would focus on sort of environmental goods and services. Frankly, there's actually an article about sort of overuse of fisheries in today's, I think, Wall Street Journal. If fisheries subsidies could be negotiated away. But those are to try to start to rebuild some sense of accomplishment. Over time, Glenn, first off, you now have, I think, about 164 economies. Under the MFN, most favored nation principle, if you grant a liberalization to one, you grant it to all. You're going to have to move to a pluralistic model where it starts to become coalitions of the willing. Now, and you should develop those rules and create opportunities for others to join, whether it's data or information technology or other issues. There's another sort of question, particularly related to China, which is the rules on state-owned enterprises. And if people look actually at the U.S.-Singapore FTA, which I negotiated many years ago, you'll find there's actually a series of requirements because of the state-owned enterprises in Singapore for sort of competitive neutrality. Some of those are carried forward to the TPP, and they could sort of be added to. And you'll find you can get some international support on doing that. At the same time, this is where the difficulty when you actually deal with people who aren't just from your system. If we're talking about subsidies, somebody might want to look at U.S. farm subsidies because many people think, well, we're subsidizing our farm sector. So, sometimes this goes two ways. And then there's an issue that has plagued the WTO over the past 20 years called special and differential treatment, which is the idea that developing countries that make fewer contributions, that have to make fewer commitments. To be honest, I'm not sure I'd hit this head on because it just becomes sort of an ideological debate. I would deal with it practically in terms of trying to emphasize if countries want to get benefits, they have to sort of take some of these actions. So I could see a combination of a longer term structural agenda, but also some quick wins. And I guess the one other point is, it actually started in the Obama administration, as you probably know, Glenn, that the United States started to hold off the appointment of the appellate body members. I don't like to call them judges because it really isn't a judicial system. And then the Trump administration, of course, blocked the system by refusing to support additional nominees. Interestingly enough, the European Union and many other countries went ahead and they created sort of a parallel system, which is a reminder, as American business people knows, that just because we want to shut things down means that everybody else will stop. But I would suspect that given the reality of politics, the U.S. would be wise to try to get back in the system, but also negotiate a little flexibility for political safety valves. So you may know this, Glenn. I tried something called a safeguard as opposed to anti-dumping and countervailing duty suits early in the Bush administration with steel, and I got my head handed to me. But the logic was basically, rather than use these anti-dumping and countervailing duty suits, which, as you know, economists sort of consider sort of not at all sort of appropriate to what economics would suggest, it's better for countries to acknowledge that they need a period where they're going to have an adjustment and kind of be transparent about it for an industry like steel. And this is an interesting case because the WTO decisions restricted the safeguard rules, so you really couldn't use it in that fashion. So this would be an example, or you may want to expand it. So as in many of these, if you're thinking about the WHO, the WTO, World Bank, or others, you need something that brings people along. You have to recognize the structural shift, but you also have to have an eye for package solutions.
I want to come back to the domestic breathing space argument in a minute, but one other follow up on China. You referred both to TPP, the Trans Pacific Partnership, and to the Belt and Road Initiative. Should the U.S. try to jump back in some way? Is that even feasible? And or do we need our own version of Belt and Road?
So let's take individually. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S. negotiated with 11 other economies, and then the U.S. dropped out under Trump. And again, it's common now for people to say, "Oh well, Hillary Clinton wouldn't have supported it." That's possible, but as I said, I think if Obama, had gotten it done in 7 years as opposed to 8 years, you would have seen it pass the Republican Congress. So this shows sort of the practical steps that I talk about in my book about combining, politics with your diplomacy or economics. Um, I would like to see the United States rejoin the TPP. You've got Britain making noises about the TPP. You've got actually the Chinese even acting as if they would sort of like to proceed. And by the way, that would require some big adjustments on some of the state-owned enterprises rules. I think politically it'd be very difficult. And so in my practical sense, Glenn, you know, if if I were running the trade policy now, I'd be focusing much more on the digital economy. I made some allusions to this in my remarks. But when you look at the numbers, this is just, was moving quite significantly, and now COVID has just accelerated it. And we don't really have common approaches that, whether it's for data interconnectivity and sort of the localization requirements, you basically want to allow some exchange of data in an efficient way while allowing countries to have the privacy and security requirements that they feel they need to have. So I would probably try to do that in an East Asian context to show that we're in the game. The other idea that I've had is that I think Americans have not focused as much on how Britain will really change after Brexit. And I think we have a long-term strategic interest in Britain being a global player. And so I propose that we have a North American UK trade agreement. And one of the ideas was the rewrite of NAFTA, the USMCA, as you know, had labor provisions in it, quite extensive. Well, it's hard for me to believe that Britain couldn't meet sort of whatever our union's labor standards are. And by the way, this could be a great opportunity to come up with some of the cutting edge rules for topics like digital or environmental or health or other areas. So I'm looking for ways to move the agenda forward. Given my view about the importance of North America as a unit, I would try to do it in a North American context. And frankly, I've discussed this with some Republican members of the Senate because the Trade Promotion Authority expires, and they said, look, we'd be willing to extend it for a UK deal. But this is where I make my larger point. I'm a little worried that the Biden administration feels it can be multilateral without trade, and I think it will discover eventually that this comes a cropper. As for the Belt and Road, I mean, I think there's kind of in-between positions. You may recall the Chinese came up with the idea of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the course of the Obama administration. And a lot of people opposed it. I didn't. I said, look, it depends on kind of what the governance and rules and transparency are. And I made the observation that when I was in government, we often had people from other countries saying the U.S. should do this and do that, and the U.S. should come up with the money. I don't object if other people come up with money as long as we've got the rules straight. And interestingly enough, the head of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, who had worked at the Asian Development Bank, hired a bunch of people from the World Bank, and they came up with good governance rules and anti-corruption rules and procurement rules and other things like that. And so, and they do a lot of co-financing with the World Bank. So these things, this is an example of sort of the win-win. On the Belt and Road, there's two approaches. One is obviously the United States would be better off if we can also support sort of investment in other countries. I don't, I'm still perhaps a little old school, Glenn, on saying we don't have to subsidize all this. I think that a lot of it is sort of getting the rules right and creating the right sort of conditions. But I'll give you another practical example on Belt and Road. When China had a few years ago its China Development Forum and was celebrating 40 years of economic reforms, they invited me to speak. And I said, look, here's how Asian Infrastructure Bank was well received. And look at how Belt and Road is being questioned. And people don't know, is it a geopolitical venture? Is it to use excess capacity? Is it, a development venture? It's probably all of those. I said, so why don't you take the principles that you used for the Asian development, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, transparency, anti-corruption, procurement, why don't you apply those to Belt and Road? And the head of the People's Bank of China, who Yi Gang, actually said, look, we've given your speech to Xi. And the next year, Xi gives a form of my speech. Now, at that point, Well, what the United States and others should have done is said, okay, nice words. How do we make sure? How do we operationalize this? How do we focus on these issues? This is an example of where I think you can show there's win-win possibilities while recognizing it's a different sort of political system.
I want to take you back inward and mention a moment because you mentioned domestic breathing space. Both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, in different ways, were doing this for domestic producers. But there's another way of thinking about breathing space, which is how do you help people who are left behind, whether it's by technological change, which is the bigger global force, or globalization and trade itself. Any ideas there in the policy process? I've always felt that if we want to really bolster support for globalization, and for that matter, technological change, we have to make sure that more people are included in its benefits. Any ideas on that kind of domestic breathing space?
Yeah, and this will become very important, Glenn, because, for example, Catherine Tai, who was just confirmed as the new U.S. Trade Representative, when asked by Senator Toomey, it was your job to kind of open markets, and she said, well, not necessarily. And she said, it's the focus on workers. Well, which workers? The farmers who export most of their product? I mean, the difference between $15 bushel soybean and $5 bushel is basically opening up foreign markets. Is the fact that export workers earn about 20% more because they're more productive? Or are we going to try to protect the old industries? So it's a nice politically appealing sort of answer, but it doesn't really get you very far as to what you're going to accomplish. And of course, this brings us to the issue which both you and I have focused on, which is I do think you have to help people adapt to change, and you have to be willing to allow them to be more mobile. That deals with everything from their health care to their sort of pension support. Um, and I think increasingly, as I mentioned in my remarks, you're going to find service sector workers also become sort of part of the international trading system. And so you have to help workers be able to adjust. And frankly, particularly for this private sector audience, the government record on this is so-so at best. I think you're going to find more and more needs for the private sector to sort of take this on. And you've seen some big companies figure out, they need to tell their workforce, look, these are the jobs going away. These are the jobs that are going to be created. Kind of what are the skill sets, and how can we actually work with educational institutions, perhaps using certifications and other aspects to sort of help people adjust to change. So that clearly, that combination, education, skills, private sector connectivity, will be part of kind of the United States' sort of future. And again, this is where I also referenced how technology keeps adapting. Glenn, I certainly wouldn't claim myself to be a sort of advanced technologist, but I've tried to have some contacts with Silicon Valley and other issues. And it's just striking to see, what gets created, the adaptability, the focus. And I think we could tap some of this in terms of what we need in terms of skills development and training. So it goes back to my principal thesis is, America's trump card is our openness to goods, capital, ideas, people. Um, like any other country, we don't always get everything right, but if you're open to competition and new people and ideas, you figure out your mistakes earlier, which actually gives us an advantage, I think, over China or authoritarian systems. But frankly, for the past 4 years, we moved away from that concept of openness. And I hope you can see a partial move back, but as I've noted on the trade side, they need prodding.
Now, you mentioned Catherine Tai. So let's take a team of Catherine Tai. Let's throw in Secretary of State Blinken. Let's throw in Secretary of Treasury Yellen and other colleagues. What's your biggest piece of advice for them in thinking about America's role in globalization and drawing on your interest in history, economic, political, or social? What's a spot on example you'd have them focus on? But besides, of course, buying multiple copies of America in the World.
Well, again, I'll start out with a practical political sense. When my boss of many years, James Baker, was chief of staff with Ronald Reagan, he said to President Reagan in 1981, Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. So now Biden has got economic recovery and pandemic recovery. And so, not surprisingly, that's their prime focus. And you and others have observed the politics of that with the $1.9 trillion act. They weren't going to err on the small side. there'll be some bigger long-term questions about that, but I think the execution of that will now be very, very important. Secondly, because of that the president has a very full plate. On top of that, you add immigration, you add sort of climate change, you add sort of racial issues. Um, it's natural that the foreign policy could connect with some of the domestic policy, and look at how the administration with this quad group with India and Japan and Australia focused on bringing India in with sort of with the vaccine development. Um, I'm glad to see we're trying to do a little bit more with Mexico and Canada these days. I'm a little worried at their early steps on the immigration issue. This could sort of blow up on them, but and then you can see on the climate and biological security issues, this is a natural to focus on with some of your allies and sort of rebuild partnerships. Having said this, you can't lose sight of the traditional security issues. And, Harold Macmillan had a comment when he was reelected prime minister in Britain, asked about his plans, and he said, events, dear boy, events. And I never totally liked that because I believe it's important to have a framework and a strategy, but there's something to that, how you're going to react to the events going forward. So where I would bring it home is the topic we've talked about, Glenn, which is I think it's very hard to have a multilateralism unless you have trade in the forefront. And I'm a little concerned about that basically the Democratic constituencies, combined with the fact that they've got to manage, sort of keep the coalition together for the legislative program, will lead them to backpedal on trade and come up with nice phrases like, oh, well, we're here to protect the workers and so on and so forth. Well, we just said, which workers, which farmers, how are you preparing for the future? And it goes back to a point I kind of drew out early in the book. Many people, of course, know about Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams was on that committee. What they don't know is John Adams chaired his own committee, which was the Model Treaty of 1776. And if you look at that treaty, it was a trade agreement. That's what it was about. And what was behind that was not just trade as economic efficiency, but it was a prime contact with the rest of the world. And recognized in an era of empires and mercantilism, it was opening the role for private sector actors. So whether they be missionaries or business people or engineers or soldiers of fortune, that's been one of America's sort of greatest strengths. But in the environment which we just described of tension, of governance of globalization with the reality of it, the United States needs to be pressing forward with a framework in which we can use the genius of our private sector.
I couldn't agree more. And that is a wonderful place to leave it with strategy, mind the events, look in as well as out, and openness is a great hallmark. And who can't like somebody who quoted Alexander Hamilton, a great Columbia University or at least King's College graduate? So, Bob Zoellick, thank you so much for joining us at the conference.
Thanks for inviting me, Glenn, and thanks for the Chazen Institute for all they're doing for the future on these.